Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan political analysis. I am your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about the freedom of speech and how far it should go. It's always a salient topic, but arguably even more salient these days. If any one aspect is emblematic of the American system of government, it is the freedom of speech. There are 5 freedoms in the First Amendment: religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. But speech is arguably the foundation for the other 4 freedoms and many of our other freedoms that we have. Yet the reach and limits of the freedom of speech have been constantly tested and refined over American history. Our views on the freedom of speech can be influenced by many factors, like whether we are at war or peace, the goal of the speech and rhetoric in question, our biases in support or opposition of the people who are speaking, and our level of effective polarization. While we should be consistent in our application of the freedom of speech, that isn't always the case, not just because of biases, but also because it is often difficult to figure out where exactly the line should be drawn. So, today we're going to cover a bunch of aspects of the freedom of speech. How did it become such an important part of the fabric of America? What are some government laws that tested freedom of speech? How has the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on free speech cases in the past? Why does freedom of speech protect awful things that are said? How have biases affected how we think of freedom of speech? And finally, how do we protect and preserve the freedom of speech, not just legally, but in our personal lives? These are always important questions, but perhaps even more so in the midst of current free speech debates. So, let's talk about it. The beginnings of free speech in America. Freedom of speech is a concept that has roots all the way back to ancient Greece, and it was one of the guiding principles that the founding fathers looked to when forming a new government due to American dealings with the British Crown. Freedom of speech, especially speech that's critical of government, became an important foundation of American life. However, that freedom of speech was not originally part of the U.S. Constitution, which came after the Articles of Confederation. And the whole Bill of Rights was not part of the U.S. Constitution. That's why it's Amendments 1 through 10. It wasn't part of the original document. Many framers of the Constitution thought it was unnecessary to add, that it was basically a given in the Constitution, that it was self-explanatory in that regard. But opponents to the Constitution didn't believe so, and that was one of their many gripes with the Constitution and wanting to stay with the Articles of Confederation. But as somewhat of a concession, the Bill of Rights was added a couple of years after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, which was fully ratified in 1789, and 1791 was when the Bill of Rights was ratified. And that included the First Amendment rights of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. But interestingly enough, and this might sound very strange coming from today, but the federal Bill of Rights initially was not considered to apply to the state governments, only the federal government and how people interacted with it. The U.S. Senate actually rejected an amendment that would have applied the Bill of Rights to the states before the Bill of Rights was ratified. So even though that was a topic of discussion, that wasn't quite added there. Now, some state constitutions do have their own Bill of Rights, and a few of them had it prior to the U.S. Constitution. And you still see them in a lot of state constitutions, if not all of them. And oftentimes they're more concrete and specific than the U.S. Bill of Rights, like state constitutions are in general. The U.S. Constitution is a lot more vague and broad, whereas state constitutions are always more specific. Some are more specific than others, but in any case, the Bill of Rights, there's usually a lot more to it when you look at the state constitutional versions of it. Following the 14th Amendment's ratification, the Supreme Court started applying the U.S. Bill of Rights to state governments and how we interact with them as well through the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. And that applying that due process clause to the Bill of Rights and having that Bill of Rights be applied to the state governments is called the incorporation doctrine. This was not immediate, however, even though it was intended to be during Reconstruction. Much of these changes where the incorporation doctrine was applied did not occur until the 20th century, well after Reconstruction. Reconstruction happening to about 1877-ish because of the Compromise of 1877, where Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president as Republican. In exchange, Republicans ended Reconstruction in the South. So even though that incorporation doctrine was trying to be implemented for the Bill of Rights to be applied to the state governments, then it didn't exactly happen then. It took decades later for it to start being that way. And speaking of having that Bill of Rights be, the U.S. Bill of Rights be applied more to the state governments, there have been a lot of government laws that have tested the freedom of speech over time. Some obviously more controversial than others, some more directly dealing with freedom of speech than others. And so many of these laws and actions have been controversial as to whether or not they violated the First Amendment rights to freedom of speech and the related First Amendment rights of religion, press, assembly, and petition. And these laws didn't always lead to Supreme Court cases. Sometimes they did, and sometimes they technically didn't suppress free speech if you look at the letter of the law, but they basically found ways to do so. They didn't necessarily at face value deal with freedom of speech, but ultimately they did in some way, like Jim Crow laws. Some of them were not necessarily directly about freedom of speech, but we'll get to those in a minute. And there's too many of these examples to cover, but here are some of the major ones to know about. Probably the earliest one to really test the freedom of speech was the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. During John Adams' administration, the second president of the United States, these laws were passed, and they authorized the president to deport non-citizens, permitted their arrest during wartime, limited speech critical about the government. The U.S. was on the brink of war with France. Ultimately didn't quite happen. There was a quasi-war, quote-unquote, but they didn't actually go to full-out war, even though only a couple of decades before the French had helped us achieve our independence. But these laws were directed against the Democratic Republican Party. It wasn't really about unity during wartime. It was deliberately targeted towards one party because the Democratic Republican Party, who would eventually become the Democratic Party, was typically favored by new citizens. So the ruling Federalists put these laws to basically stifle them. And so that was a major contributor to the Federalists' defeat in the 1800 elections. And after that, the Federalist Party never came close to taking power again. That effectively killed them. They still lasted for a couple of decades afterwards, but they were pretty much finished after that point. There was also Jim Crow laws, which I just mentioned, which were designed to reproduce the conditions of slavery for Black people without technically being slavery. So yeah, they weren't being put in chains and working 18-hour, 20-hour days for no pay, and they couldn't do anything of their own accord, but heavily restricted their ways of life so that they might as well still be considered slaves, especially in the South, with various racist laws designed to suppress Black voices, such as their ability to vote. You had poll taxes, for example, which a lot of Black people at the time were too poor to pay, which you basically had to pay a fee to go and vote. And then just racial intimidation in general, trying to get them to not vote by any means necessary. So even though they had the right to vote, they ostensibly had their First Amendment rights. Especially in the South, governments found ways to stifle their freedom of speech. You also had the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. The Espionage Act made it a crime to convey information intended to interfere with the World War I effort. And the Sedition Act imposed penalties for a wide range of speech, including speech abusing the U.S. government, quote unquote, the flag, the Constitution, the military. And it's also the time of the first Red Scare, which was fueled by the Russian Revolution of 1917. So, like many times when people try to curtail freedom of speech, they use it as an excuse to say, well, we need to do it to ensure safety and security, which sometimes might be the case, but then sometimes there's an ulterior motive. A lot of times there's an ulterior motive. And then you had a second Red Scare during the 1940s and 1950s. Primarily, Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, was on a rampage to root out communists in government, both real and perceived. And there were, I believe, a few that were communists, but a lot of times they either were provably not communist or there was not enough evidence to say they were. But a lot of it, of course, was just Joseph McCarthy being on a power trip. And a lot of people had their lives ruined, basically, and couldn't really defend themselves. And anybody who wanted to speak up and say the House Un-American Activities Commission, or Committee, excuse me, the HUAC, and all these other anti-communist efforts were going too far, you basically were labeled a communist sympathizer. And eventually these false accusations did catch up with Joseph McCarthy, particularly when he went after the army and accused them of being filled with communists. That's when public sentiment started to turn against him. But those are just a few of the cases of government laws testing freedom of speech, how far they could go, what were the limits. A lot of times it overstepped its bounds. Now, as for the judicial branch of government, not Congress and president, when it comes to historical SCOTUS cases, over American history, there has been loads of cases dealing directly and indirectly with the freedom of speech, especially since World War I. So many of these cases, there's just so many of these cases that deal with freedom of speech that you just can't cover them all in one episode of the podcast. And that's not even getting into cases that are indirectly dealing with freedom of speech. And then you have state level rulings on free speech that SCOTUS did not take up appeals on, because obviously you had state governments and their state Bill of Rights, and then later on when the incorporation doctrine was applying the U.S. Bill of Rights to the state governments, you had a lot of other state court rulings about freedom of speech and where it extended. So that's not even getting into that either. But in short, I'll give some key rulings in a minute, but in short, speech that is protected and not protected includes protected speech. You can not salute the American flag. You can't be compelled to do so. You can wear black armbands to protest a war. You can use certain offensive words and phrases to convey political messages, to contribute money to political campaigns with certain restrictions, to advertise commercial products and professional services, again, with some restrictions, like, for example, tobacco companies can no longer make ads for cigarettes to put on TV, and you can engage in symbolic speech like burning the American flag. Speech that is not protected includes any that is meant to incite imminent lawless action. You can't make or distribute obscene materials, or at least to just anybody. You can't burn draft cards as an anti-war protest. Students can't print articles in a school newspaper over objections of the school administration. Students can't make an obscene speech at a school-sponsored event. Students can't advocate illegal drug use at a school-sponsored event. You can't defame people, so whether it's libel or slander. You can't plagiarize, and you can't give out true threats to people's lives and health. But some of the more specific instances of free speech rulings and whether that free speech was protected or not, or considered free speech that should be protected, one of the earliest ones was Schenck versus the United States in 1919. And that ruled that freedom of speech can be curtailed if there is a quote-unquote clear and present danger. And in this case, Charles Schenck and Elizabeth Bear, two socialist activists, they distributed leaflets urging people to disobey the draft in World War I. They consider the draft a violation of the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery, prohibited involuntary servitude, and they were charged with violating the Espionage Act of 1917, which we mentioned a bit earlier, by attempting to cause insubordination in the military and obstruction of recruitment. Those were the charges levied against them. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes basically, well, the Supreme Court basically said the Espionage Act was fine, but Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes concluded that courts owed greater deference to the government during wartime, even if constitutional rights were at stake. And that's where you hear the phrase, if you've ever heard the phrase, falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater. Some people leave out the falsely part, but that's a key part of the phrase, falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater. That comes from this case, which is how Holmes compared Schenck and Bear's activities of disobeying the draft in World War I. A couple decades later, you had West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett in 1943, and that ruled that you cannot compel people to salute the American flag. Children in a family of Jehovah's Witnesses refused to perform the salute to the flag and were sent home from school for non-compliance. It was considered a violation of West Virginia law, where the salute was considered part of school activities and you had to do it. But the court ruled that you cannot enforce a unanimity of opinion on any topic. So they said that compelling people to salute the American flag was unconstitutional. Then you had Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969, where it was sort of an overturn of Schenck versus United States. It was a partial overturn. You sometimes see Supreme Court cases not fully overturn a previous ruling, but partially do so. So it ruled that in Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969, it ruled that a state can only forbid speech if it is A, directed at inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and B, likely to incite or produce such action. So basically, you're trying to make a lawless action happen, and your action in doing so is likely to make that action happen. A KKK leader, a higher up leader in Ohio, Clarence Brandenburg, he made a speech about taking quote unquote revenge on African Americans and Jews, potentially even marching on DC on the 4th of July. And he had a reporter cover the KKK rally for their local news. And because of this, Brandenburg was convicted of advocating violence under Ohio's criminal syndicalism statute. But the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the state law was overly broad and in violation of the U.S. Constitution. So it built upon Schenck versus U.S. by proposing that there had to be an imminent lawless action test that seems to advocate overthrowing the U.S. government, and there has to be reason to believe that that action that's being provoked would actually happen. Same year as that case was the Tinker versus Des Moines case in 1969. Students' rights to free speech did not end when at school. They can wear armbands as they are separate from actions and conduct, as long as that conduct did not, quote, materially and substantially interfere, end quote, with school operations. Several students, including the namesake Mary Beth Tinker, wore black armbands at school as a means to protest the Vietnam War and the draft to Vietnam. And they were dismissed from classes from school for refusing to take the armbands off, but the court ruled that the school violated their constitutional rights by doing so. A couple years later, Cohen versus California in 1971, ruled that states cannot ban expletives being used to convey political messages simply out of a concern for disturbing the peace. They needed a bit better reason to do that. Paul Robert Cohen, the namesake for the case, he had worn a jacket, and again, this is during the Vietnam War, during when the Vietnam War had a draft. He wore a jacket saying, I'm not going to say the word, F the draft, stop the war. Again, referring to the Vietnam War, and that kind of speech was illegal under a California statute. But the court ruled in his favor and said that he can wear that jacket. And then Texas versus Johnson in 1989, where the burning of the American flag is considered protected expressive speech. Gregory Lee Johnson burned the flag in protest of Reagan administration policies. I believe it was during the 1984 Republican National Convention, and he was arrested for it under Texas law. So years later, about 5 years later, it was ruled that his rights were violated, that you can burn the flag in protest if you want. That's freedom of speech. And that's just a few of the major cases dealing with freedom of speech. There's just too many of those to actually cover. But that Texas versus Johnson case is a good segue into this next topic, which is why the freedom of speech protects a lot of controversial speech, even ones that we would consider awful, that are objectively awful, like racism or sexism or homophobia. Despite the many conflicts over how far freedom of speech extends, it does generally protect controversial, even abhorrent speech, as long as it isn't already prohibited by law in other ways, like if you're trying to incite imminent lawless action and that action is likely to happen because of you provoking it. Why should we protect this speech, though? It may seem like, at face value, why would we want these kinds of things to be said? It's not about whether we want it to be said. You can start a slippery slope when government deems things as too awful to be said or expressed. And a lot of times that's just used as an excuse to stifle differing opinions. And then that means the government can pick and choose who gets to say what, which means there is no real freedom of speech. If you're picking and choosing what people get to say, that's not real freedom. And also legally, it can be hard to come up with concrete definitions of things. When you're writing legislation, there are often debates as to how exactly to word laws for various reasons. Sometimes laws can be considered too vague. They might be considered too specific. What is considered hate speech, for example? There's all these little nooks and crannies, and then everybody's got their own interests as to what exactly kind of speech they may or may not want curtailed. So sometimes there's those kinds of things that you know it when you see it, but you can't actually legally define it, or even if you could, it's still something that is considered freedom of speech. And some things that are controversial now become much more commonly accepted by later generations. If you look at gay marriage, for example, 50, 60, 70 years ago, that was completely unheard of, if completely anathema. Now it's a much more commonplace thing. And sometimes what is commonly accepted now was once controversial. If we talk about dress code, for example, I'm not saying dress code is good or bad. I'm just saying how people dress today. You would not see it from 60, 70, 80 years ago in a lot of cases. So what is considered acceptable or not often changes over time. And a lot of times that's for the better. Sometimes it's not, but some change isn't always good, change isn't always bad. Ideally, yes, we shouldn't say things that are racist, sexist, homophobic, or any other bigoted things. Yes, it would be nice for people to not say that. But if you really want to try to change the minds of actual bigots, which is difficult, but it is possible, silencing them is not going to do it anyway, and it's just going to make them worse. They're going to act out even more so if you try to stifle their opinion. But a lot of times people also try to make an excuse and say because somebody does not agree with something, they'll say something is bigoted, and it's not necessarily the case. But it also brings up another good point. Whether you can say something versus whether you should say something. Freedom of speech protects a lot of things, but is it something you should say? Paraphrase Jeff Goldblum's character from Jurassic Park, Ian Malcolm. You're sometimes so preoccupied with whether we could say something that we don't think if we should say something. Just because the freedom of speech is important to protect, we're not always good about determining whether we should say it. And the freedom of speech, a lot of times people don't realize that that does not mean freedom from consequences. A lot of people don't want to be accountable for what they say and do, but that's a lot of times that's not how it works, or at least people should be held more accountable for things they say, and by more people, but a lot of times people just want to only hold accountable the people that are not on their quote-unquote side of the aisle. And also some jobs, for example, limit what you can say in the context of the work and when you represent that employer. A lot of times that is allowed by law, but that can get a little bit murky when you start to ask, are those employers doing it at the behest of government? Then that's where you start getting into a little bit of a gray area. Does that start to become suppression of free speech? But generally speaking, employers have a lot more leeway as to what kind of speech they can restrict compared to the government. There's also that difference between private and public settings. Private settings are generally more restrictive on what you can say, or people who own that private property, what they allow to say. Like if you say something that somebody does not like when you're at their house, they can kick you out. Yeah, you're free to say what you want to say, but that doesn't mean you can't. Doesn't mean you can escape the consequence of being kicked out of that house. So another case of, well, should you say something? A lot of times not. But there are some questions that we should all ask ourselves when it comes to whether we can say something versus should say something. So if you can say this thing that you want to say, should you say it? One question to ask is what you're about to say unnecessarily inflammatory? Now, some people are going to get mad no matter what because they can't accept the fact that some people think differently than them, even if you say it in the most civil manner you possibly can. But if we're saying it in a very inciting manner, if we're purposely trying to rile people up, should you say it? Especially when you're trying to do it on purpose, because you see rage baiters all the time on social media, which is very effective because people engage with that kind of content. But should you incite people? No, you really generally should not. Now, sometimes you might have to say something that grinds people's gears, but if you're just doing it just to get a rise out of people, it's probably not that helpful. And even if we think we should say something, how should we say it? Even if the thing that we were going to say that's inflammatory, if we really feel it needs to be said, we could maybe say it in a more neutral tone, more civil tone. Not necessarily polite. Civil and polite are two different things. Politeness is sometimes not what's necessary, but you should be civil about it. Another question to ask is it reasonable to argue that what you're going to say is bigoted? Now, yes, bigoted speech is, generally speaking, protected speech, but you really shouldn't be saying bigoted things. Now, some people will say you're being bigoted with what you say, but that's just because they don't like what you said, and they're just going to throw a hissy fit about it. But if what you're saying is reasonably assumed to be racist, sexist, homophobic, whatever kind of bigotry it is, you don't need to say it, quite frankly. We don't need to be jerks towards people purely because they are of a different demographic group. Another question to ask yourself, are you actually trying to solve an issue or contribute to a solution with your speech? Or are you just trying to grandstand, attack, incite? Because a lot of times people just put their opinion out there and are just doing it just because they just can't help themselves, or they're just mad about something, so they need to put it out there right away. I used to do that when I was in high school. It's very unhelpful, dumb. Just saying it just to say something is not actually solving anything. Now, if you really want to actually contribute to a discussion, that's great. But if you're just trying to do it just to signal that you're holier than thou, or that you're actually trying to get people riled up, or you're just flat out bashing other people, no, you shouldn't be doing it. Now, in most cases, you can do that. But again, doesn't mean you should say that. And then one last question, not necessarily the only other question you can ask yourself, but another big one. Is your speech trying to silence other opinions or advocating for the suppression of those opinions purely because you don't like those opinions? Which happens a lot of times from people across the political spectrum. They try to shut out other people's opinions, not necessarily through legal means, but sometimes in their personal lives. If you are doing that, you don't truly respect freedom of speech. If you only believe in the freedom of speech for your side of the aisle, then you don't actually believe in freedom of speech. You just want a whole bunch of yes men basically congratulating you, patting you on the back for having the same kind of politics. It means you want people to pander to you. That's not how things should be working. But that's a good segue into this last section of this episode, and that's how do we preserve and promote the freedom of speech? Promoting freedom of speech in government laws and conduct and how we interact with it, that's one thing. And obviously, it's very important. And that's typically what we deal with when we talk about freedom of speech. But we should also be promoting freedom of speech in our daily lives and how we interact with people. So, how we actually talk to people, where we decide to live, who we decide to become friends with. All these things are all too often influenced by whether our political views coincide with those people we're interacting with. There is evidence to indicate that more and more people are choosing to live in similar-minded neighborhoods with the same party. So Republicans are moving more and more to Republican neighborhoods. Democrats are moving more and more to Democratic neighborhoods. That's not how we should be handling this. When we don't personally live up to the ideal of supporting free speech like we say we believe, not just, hey, I think legally we should protect people's freedom of speech, but you don't demonstrate that in your personal life, I think the idea that you support freedom of speech kind of rings hollow. When we don't live up to that ideal of supporting free speech like we say we do, you become more likely to be okay with government suppression of free speech and disregard for differing opinions, because all you're getting is people who think like you, telling you how smart you are because you think like them. And if you're not getting other opinions, a lot of times you're going to think you've got everything figured out and that other opinions don't matter. And that's not how we should be handling things. So how can we better preserve and promote the freedom of speech, not just when it comes to government, but in our own personal lives? Because I think the fact that we're not protecting freedom of speech in our personal lives or respecting it in our personal lives, I think has been a major contributor to government attempts to try to stifle freedom of speech. Tips to think about when trying to promote freedom of speech in your daily lives, in your personal interactions. Number one, do not demonize and dehumanize people. When we treat people as subhuman because they think differently than us, we become more likely to support suppressing their opinions because, well, they don't even need to be regarded. Why would I care about their opinions? Yeah, go ahead and shut them out. They're being stupid. They're being evil. They're being whatever it is. Whatever excuse it is we come up with to try to stop people from putting forth their opinion. Do you want to be treated the same way? Probably not. Now, even when people think about that question and say, no, I don't want to be treated that way, they still don't care because they're like, well, at least it's not me. I'm going to go ahead and try to stop these people from putting forth their opinion about things. So do not demonize and dehumanize people because you'll become a lot less approving of free speech because you'll be okay with other people losing their freedom of speech, which means you don't actually support freedom of speech. Another tip to preserve freedom of speech in our personal lives: be adamant, especially in the right to speak for others that don't think like you. This is actually more important than believing in the freedom of speech for your side. It's even more important for you to stand for the rights of other people like you because they'll probably return the favor if you do that. It's like that Voltaire quote of, I don't agree, no, I'm going to paraphrase it, but I don't agree with your stance, but I'll defend your right to say it. I believe it was Voltaire. A lot of times we only care about freedom of speech when it's for people we support, which, again, that is not actually freedom of speech. There's a lot of hypocrisy in arguments about why Group A should be free to speak, but Group B should not in the same exact situation. Or why Group A is being suppressed in a certain situation, but Group B in the same situation is not being suppressed. There's a lot of mental gymnastics that go on in that regard. And again, that's not how we should be treating this. Freedom of speech is for everybody or it's for no one. And I think all of us would rather have, well, most of us would rather have it be for everybody. But we have to make sure that we're being cognizant of that in how we interact with people. Another tip for preserving the freedom of speech in our personal lives: do not put ourselves in information silos. Be willing to surround ourselves with a variety of viewpoints. Don't have any yes men. Don't have any people congratulating you for being a conservative like them, a liberal like them, an independent, moderate like them, whatever the case is. We don't need people pandering to us. Nobody should be being pandered to and told how smart they are just because they share political opinions. Now, this isn't entirely our fault. Social media algorithms, the fragmentation of media in general, have done a lot to wall us off from other opinions that are not ours, or even sometimes opinions that are similar to us, but are not quite the same, because some people get pissed off at their own side because they're not enough on their side. Like when you hear Republicans and Democrats complain about quote unquote fake Republicans or fake Democrats, call them rhinos and dinos, Republicans in name only, Democrats in name only for short. It's that no true Scotsman fallacy. So some people will get mad even if they're like 80% on their side, but not 100% on their side, because people need uniformity for some reason. So it's partly the fault of media, but it's also partly our own fault. We need to be more proactive in trying to find other people's opinions. We also need to teach people how to do that better as well, because we don't teach people to critically think as well as we should. The fourth tip I will leave for how to preserve freedom of speech in our personal lives: take the time to truly understand why people think the way they do, what they're actually thinking, and why they think that. Sometimes the reasons we think people are why they believe a certain way, it's not actually why they believe what they believe. A lot of times it's actually not. And I've encountered that too, where I've seen, I think somebody thinks a certain way and I think I know why they believe a certain way. I still do it. We all do it. But then later on I hear from them and I'm like, oh, okay. I see your point. Or and I might still not agree, but I'm like, okay, well, that's not why I thought you were thinking that in the first place. Everybody has biases that influence how they think, whether they realize it or not. Everybody's got them. We all think our biases are less so than other people, or that we've broken free of our biases, or that we're not being biased. We've just figured things out. No. Take the time to actually understand why other people believe what they believe. You don't have to agree. In fact, a lot of times you're not going to agree. You don't have to change your mind. Not necessarily. But you have to give people a chance to say why they believe what they believe and actually make a concerted effort to understand that. And then the last tip I'll leave about promoting freedom of speech in our personal lives is we need to understand that rhetoric is not inherently violent. There's a lot of cases on the left and the right where people treat differing opinions as inherently violent or that it's going to foment violence. Even if it's something that's really despicable that's said, you can't just assume that it's going to foment violence. Go back to that imminent lawless action text, for example. We can find things that other people say to be despicable, abhorrent, etc., but it doesn't mean we can suppress them. And suppressing rarely, if ever, changes those opinions anyways. If you're really actually trying to make people, for example, not bigoted, like I said earlier, silencing them is probably not going to do it. Now, even if you don't silence them, a lot of them won't change their minds anyways. But the point is, they still have the freedom of speech. We don't have to like it. Affirming other people's freedom of speech does not mean you have to like what they say. A lot of times you should not like what they have to say. But they have the right to say it, as long as they don't violate any laws that have been already established to be constitutional when it comes to restricting freedom of speech. And last thought I'll leave here is we really need to remind ourselves that we are a pluralistic nation, or at least we're supposed to be. Now, that's something I want to do a podcast episode or maybe have a guest on, is pluralism and how pluralistic are we? Because a lot of people think that we're not really all that pluralistic and that it's a small number of interests that have all the power. That's a whole other conversation. But at the very least, we're supposed to be a pluralistic nation. We're supposed to be a marketplace of ideas. The system was designed to have a bunch of interests competing for political influence. The Federalist Papers even say as such. Now, this country has not always lived up to its pluralistic ideal. For example, how we've treated race over time, or women. So, like a lot of cases, the American ideal and reality have not always matched. But we have made incredible strides to achieving that pluralistic ideal. And we should strive to improve in this aspect every day. We're supposed to be a marketplace of ideas, and progress only happens with the free exchange of ideas, because nobody has everything figured out. Nobody has all the answers. Nobody's worldview is 100% accurate. So the only way we actually make things better for everybody is if we have a free exchange of ideas. And who knows, maybe you'll hear an idea that even if you don't entirely agree with it, you think, well, you know what, this one part of it, that actually makes sense. And you wouldn't have ever known, you wouldn't have gotten any better because you were trying to suppress that speech. Or not even necessarily suppress that speech, but you tried to wall yourself by making an information silo. So make sure that we realize that the freedom of speech is not just about how the government treats us, it's about how we treat each other, whether indirectly through who we put in office or directly in how we interact with people. Because might sound surprising, but sometimes people who think differently than you aren't actually bad people. Even if they are misguided, they're not always bad people. Now, whether they're misguided, that's a lot of times that's our own biases talking anyways. But people who think differently than you are not inherently bad people. Maybe they just haven't heard your side of the argument, but we need to be a little bit more understanding of people. And even if we don't agree with what they say, we need to affirm their right to say it. So that's going to do it for today's episode of the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, share with everybody you know. My links to the show notes, my Facebook, my Paul Rader, author and speaker, LinkedIn profile, my medium.com writings, my 5-day educational email course about mistakes we make when trying to depolarize American politics and why we make those mistakes and how we can fix those mistakes so that we actually depolarize politics. And my book on Amazon, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Could Become More Competitive. Just not arguing that we should or shouldn't have more independence, just talking about the challenges they face and actual ways they can improve their station. And my website, paulrader.org. That's going to do it, though, for today's episode. So, again, thank you so much. And until next time, take care.